Okay, so welcome back. This is part 3 in our series where hopefully we're going to help you understand the very complex and wonderful world of 3D computer graphics. And we're going to use this piece of software you see here. This is called Blender, and I encourage you to look at the previous videos where we showed you basically what is a 3D object and how do I get Blender downloaded, install, and we talked about some basic navigation and setup of Blender. Again, I encourage you to take a look at that. And in this video, we're going to start by showing you some of the basic tools available so you can start building your own objects. And in future parts of this series, we're going to look at building objects. You can see here we've got an animation. I built this fighter object in Blender, and I've animated it and put materials on it. And we've done what's called compositing. We're going to talk later about compositing, the animation, and putting this all together to make this little animated sequence. So we're going to go through all of that, and hopefully more than like many videos you see where they say, well, if you want to do this, just press this button. Our goal here, like most of the videos on this channel, is to help you understand what's going on behind the scenes and how things really work rather than just what button to press, so that you actually learn how to do things on your own. Okay, so here we are in what's called the default scene in Blender. After you start it up, you should get this scene, and we showed you in the previous video how to tweak this scene a little bit to make it a little bit easier for you and get these gizmos, for example. So you should see something like this, and you can look over here on the top right that has a list of all the objects in the scene. We've got a camera, we've got a cube, and we've got a light. We're going to ignore the camera and the light and just focus on this cube. So we've got the cube selected. Now, one thing we want to modify in this layout or this 3D view is we want to add a little bit of information that's going to make it a little bit easier for us when we do our modeling of our objects. And that is over here on the left. These are called statistics. And they will help us better understand exactly what is comprising our object that we're editing, in terms of telling us exactly how many vertices, how many edges, how many faces we've got, and how many are selected. And that's going to be very important because one of the key challenges in editing and modeling in 3D is making sure you don't have any duplicate vertices or edges or faces. As we showed before, our object, we talked before what comprises an object. You see we've got these vertices and edges and faces. We want to make sure that we don't have duplicates that we don't see, that we're not aware of. So this will help us know exactly what is comprising our object in terms of vertices, edges, and faces, to make sure there's no hidden stuff that might really mess up our modeling and our rendering to see what we've got. So this is going to be very helpful. Now to get there, we're going to go to the 1, 2, 3 on the top right, the third drop down, where if you hover it says overlays, and we're going to go down to statistics, and you can see if I unclick it, the statistics go away. If I click it, we see the statistic. The other nice feature we're going to want to use is when we are modeling, we're editing this object, often we're going to want to have what's called an orthographic view of the object. And for example, here we have, you look at the gizmos we talked about before, up is the z-axis, this red axis is the x-axis, and this is the y-axis. Often we're going to want to look at the object directly down a certain axis so that we can have accurate measurements and we can do accurate editing. To do that, we just go up to the gizmo. So for example, if I want to look down the x-axis, I click on this x circle, highlight the x, and it will automatically jump me into orthographic view, looking at a flat view of this face along the x-axis. And you can see the nice thing is it gives us this grid, a nice clean grid where we can accurately measure and apply our editing and make sure it's very accurate, compared to if we're doing it in this mode, this perspective view. It's going to be a lot more difficult to do accurate editing. And of course, to get from the orthographic out to the perspective, you middle mouse button click, and that will allow us to rotate. So now let's look at some of the tools we're going to use to edit this object, to modify the object. And like I say, there's only like 4 really important tools, maybe 5 that we're going to use all the time. So we're going to focus on those, and they should help you maybe 90% of the time. Now, we talked before about object mode. Right now, you see up in the upper left, we're in object mode, which allows you to select individual objects and modify them as an entire object. Often, we're going to want to, instead of modifying the entire object at once, we're going to want to access the individual components, such as the vertices and the edges and the faces. So to do that, we're going to want to change the mode we're in. Right now, I've got my cube selected. I'm in object mode. If I want to edit the vertices, edges, and faces, and maybe add more faces or whatever, I make sure my object is selected, go to this object mode dropdown, and go to edit mode. And now you can see we are in a different mode, and that allows us to edit this particular object. You can no longer edit the other objects, only this particular object. And this is where these statistics are going to help us, because they're going to tell us, you know, in this case, we've got 8 vertices, and this says, I've got, over here where it says vertices, I got 0 selected out of 8 vertices. And if I drag select, it says now I've selected 1 out of 8. When we are modifying our geometry, we're going to want to be able to access separately either the vertices, like you have here, or the edges, or the faces. And to do that, you can select up here, right next to this drop-down, these 3 modes are the selection modes. The far left, you got this little dot. This is vertex selection mode, which we're in now. So I can click on a vertex and I can select it. I can click on this and select that. Or I can drag select and select those 3. Or I can go into edge select, which is the middle one. So I click on that and I can select this edge. Or I can shift select and select those 2. So you can drag and shift to select multiple edges or vertices or faces. And then I can go into face select mode, and I have 0 selected out of 6. I can click on this, and now I've got 1 selected out of 6. So it's important to keep in mind you've got either vertex or edge or face selection mode. And that's going to be important depending on what you want to modify. You might want to modify faces, so you're going to need to be in face selection mode. Now that we know how to select, let's look over here on the far left, this list of icons. And you can ignore 90% of this. We're only going to look at these down here. You can see if I hover over this little box with a white top, it says extrude region. That's going to be very important, as is the next one, which is Inset Faces, Bevel, and Loop Cut. So we're going to focus on those 4. Those are by far the most important tools we're going to use to modify this mesh. You're always going to be using these. The 5th one is called knife. We'll talk about that briefly. It's a lot like the loop cut, but it gives you a little bit more functionality. Unfortunately, it's a little bit more complex, but we're going to focus on these right now. So the first one is extrude. You're going to be using this a lot. And extrude does basically what it sounds like. You are extruding a face to give you more geometry. So for example, I'm now in face select mode. So let's say I want to extrude this top to give you more geometry. So I'm going to select that. I've got this face selected. And then I can go over to extrude region, and you'll get this little plus sign icon. And I grab it, and you can see what it's done is it's generated edges all around the object, and it's added 1, 2, 3, 4 more faces and more vertices. So it's added to the geometry. I can do the same on this face, click it, extrude, and now it's added more geometry. And you're going to be doing this a lot. You're going to be using this extrude tool very, very, very often. And it's a wonderful way to just add geometry. So extrude, very easy to use and very important. To get out of it, I usually go to this select box, so now I can select the next thing I want to do. So now the next tool we want to use is called Inset Faces. So what I'm going to do is I've got in object mode and I've got my cube selected, and I am going to scale this object. And let's say this front face here, I want to inset it. So I'm in object mode, I've got the object selected, I want to jump to edit mode. So I'm going to go into face select mode, very important, you remember that. Go into face select mode, select this face, and then go over to Inset Faces. And we'll see what Inset Faces does. You can see it gives us this circle and this operator here with the arrows. And what it's going to do is it's kind of like the extrude. It basically adds, in this case, 4 faces and a bunch of edges and vertices. But instead of it bringing out along this axis, it insets them. It brings them in the same plane as the face that it's modifying. So you can see it gives you this geometry, but if you look at it, you say, wait a minute, this isn't uniform. This inset, this polygon is a lot bigger compared to this. So this is brought in a lot more than this one is. And this goes to the point we made in one of the first videos. This is because when we scaled this object, we didn't apply the scale. So it's non-uniform. So we made a big mistake. When we have to keep in mind, whenever you scale your object in object mode, if you're going to then edit it, you have to make sure you apply the scale. And we're going to see the same thing when we get into the next operator, the bevel operator. So what we need to do is we need to go back into object mode, and as we said before, select that object, apply rotation and scale. And you can see we go to this and we go to the item, and you can see the scales are now at 1, so we should be good to go. Now the next tool is extremely important, and you need to use it a lot more than you think you need to use it. And the reason you need to use it a lot is if you look at this cube, this default cube, one thing you may notice is all the edges are perfectly perfect, right? They're not rounded, they are perfectly sharp 90-degree angles. And also these faces are perfectly flat. And in the real world, no edges are perfectly sharp and no faces are perfectly flat. This next tool will allow us to modify these edges so that they have some roundness. And I guarantee if you look at anything around you, go around your house, your apartment, or your office, every edge has some sort of rounding on it. Nothing is perfectly flat. So you need to get into the mindset of making sure that anything you model looks like real life stuff. And that's why I think it's very important, I mentioned before, you need to actually get a photo of the object, or better yet, hold it in your hand to see exactly what you're dealing with and what the edges and the faces actually look like, all right? So this next tool we're going to use is called the Bevel tool. And it's down below Inset Faces. So we're going to select an edge and we're going to bevel the edge. So make sure you're in edge select mode. Select this edge by clicking on it. And now we can go to the Bevel tool, and you can see it's got this little operator. And if you pull it out, it's going to bevel. By default, it only gives you this flat surface. But if you keep your left mouse button held down, you can scroll your mouse wheel and increase. So I scrolled it forward, I get now 1 edge, 2 edges, 3 edges, 4, 5, 6, and I can keep my left mouse button held down and move this and vary how big the bevel is. So it's a wonderful tool, and you can see I can go back to selection mode, and it has given us all this geometry. So it's a wonderful way to smooth your edges so they look a lot more realistic. Now keep in mind, the problems we had with the Inset Faces also apply to the bevel. If you have scaled your object and you haven't applied rotation and scale, or at least applied the scale, your bevel is going to be wrong. So you need to make sure that you have applied rotation and scale to your object anytime you rotate it and before you do any editing. Now the next tool we're going to use is down here called the loop cut. And loop cut is extremely powerful and useful. What you can do is, I am going down, I've selected a loop cut tool, and if I hover my mouse over my cube, you can see it allows me to cut all the way around the object, and it starts out with halfway between the edges of the object. And you can see it gives me a nice clean cut, and all I have to do is click the left mouse button and it cuts. If I want to add more, I can now hover in the middle of this section and click down and it will give me another cut. Also, if I want to move that cut, I can click down and hold it down. You can see it gives me a couple arrows. I can now move that cut and place it where I want and let go, and it has now placed that cut. So a very, very powerful tool. I can do the same over here, press the left mouse button, move it to where I want, let go, and it's cut. And I can do that as much as I want. So now, so far, we have been editing this simple cube that's given to us when we start up Blender. And really, with a lot of things in the real world, they can be started out as cubes. But there are some other options that Blender gives us of pre-made, what are called primitive objects that are different shapes that we can use to start out with. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some of those. We can see what are the different options. So we've got our cube. We go up here to the Add Mesh, and there's a whole list of stuff we can start out with. We can start out with a plane, which basically we've got here. We've got, if we can take this top face and extract it, that's basically a plane. We can also add we've got our cube, we can add a circle, we can also add a UV sphere, which is basically a very useful sphere object. And we'll talk about what UV means later on, but it's basically a very uniform, nice sphere that we can use to start our object with. We can also add a cylinder, again, very useful, and we're going to be using that in a future video where we develop our flashlight object. We can add a cone. We can add a torus. So there's a lot of primitives that you can start out with depending on what you have to build. Now, as we said before, keep in mind, if you look, for example, at this cylinder, the edges here are perfectly sharp, and nothing in the planet has perfectly sharp edges. So you're going to have to keep that in mind where you might want to think about beveling things and modifying these, but at least it gives you a really good starting point. Now, another thing is going to be very important in our modeling, and I'm going to show that by editing this sphere. So I'm going to click on the sphere, go to Edit Mode, and I've set this up so the vertices are easy to see. Let's say, for example, I want to take this center ring of faces and I want to extrude them. We talked about the extrude tool, but how am I going to select this center ring of faces or any of this ring of faces? Well, unfortunately with Blender, it is very, as we said before, keyboard shortcut centered. And in this case, there is one keyboard shortcut that we're going to want to use. And that's going to very easily allow us to select this ring of faces. So what I want to do is go up into Face Select Mode. And I'm going to hit the Alt key and hold it down and click on the edge of one of these faces. And you can see it's automatically selected this ring. Very, very useful to be able to select a ring of faces. And you're going to need that all the time. So again, it's the Alt, hold down the Alt, and then click. As long as you've got these faces selected, it will select all these faces. So now let's say I want to extrude these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the Extrude region and click, and we get that plus operator, and I'm going to extrude. And you look at the result, it's nothing like what we want. And that's going to bring us to a very important aspect of this geometry, and that is the idea of normals. And you can see here, this little operator here is pointing in the direction of what's called a normal. So I can extrude it, and it is extruded out towards the normal. The normal is basically like this arrow here. It's pointing in the direction that is perpendicular to the face. It's pointing in the direction that the face is facing. So what we need to do with that ring, I'm going to Control Z out of this. What we need to do with that ring is we need to make sure that we extrude it not in this direction we see here, but in the direction of the normals of all of these faces. So I can go to this extrude, hold it down, and you can see it gives us some options. Extrude along normals, and now if I do it, it will extrude either in or out along those normals. So if I want to have a cool spaceship, and these are all windows, I can extrude in along normals. Those are a couple of very, very important things you need to keep in mind. You can Alt select a row, and you can also do extrude along normals, and you can extrude like this. So normals are a very important concept to keep in mind. So now the next thing we're going to talk about is the use of reference images. Now if you think that you don't need reference images because you know what everything looks like and you can model it from the top of your head, no you can't. I think one of the biggest mistakes of novice 3D artists is thinking they know what stuff looks like, and then they model it and they make a render, and viewers look at it and say, hey wait, that doesn't look right, it's missing some details, something's not right. So it's very, very important that you use reference images. Now, everybody has a smartphone with a camera. You can take images of stuff. It takes you 2 minutes to take a reference image. Or you can go online. There are billions of reference images out there of whatever you want. There's also blueprints of stuff. You'll be amazed at the blueprints of real-world stuff that's out there that you can just download freely and use as a reference image. So don't underestimate the importance of reference images. So how do you do reference images in Blender? Well, the first thing we're going to do, I want to look down the x-axis of this object, and we're going to use this in a future video where we build our flashlight. And I want to look down the x-axis orthogonally at this, and I want to put a reference image in the background. So to do that, I go up to the gizmo, go to the x-axis, click on it. Now I've got an orthogonal view like we discussed previously. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, go down to Image, Reference Image. And then what I can do is I can navigate to the location. I'm going to use this image that I took with my smartphone. I'm going to load that. And now I've got my reference image in the background. Now what I can do is I can rotate this if I want. Click on this rotate gizmo, and you can see on the right the Y rotation. I can go down to minus 90 degrees. There's keyboard shortcuts, but for now you can just use this. So now I've got my reference image in the background, and I can middle mouse button click and rotate. And anytime I want to work on this, I hit the orthogonal view for x-axis. So then I can start to put my object in here and work on it. Again, it's very, very important you use these reference images. You can also add like a top-down reference image by going on the z-axis orthogonally, adding another one, and you can do it on any axis you want. Okay, so in our next video, we're going to use the tools that we've learned about in these first two videos, and we're going to apply them and start building our simple flashlight object. So I encourage you, if you like any of these videos, hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications, and most of all, let others know that we're here. Really appreciate it. Thanks much. Take care. Have a really good day.